The sun is setting over the Nile. The river glows like liquid gold, weaving through the desert as if it were the very vein of life itself. On its banks, the silhouettes of towering pyramids pierce the horizon. They stand like sentinels of eternity, whispering stories of gods, of pharaohs, of a people who carved their dreams into stone so massive they still defy time itself. The desert winds carry the echoes of hymns once sung in temples, of prayers etched into walls, of a civilization that dared to believe it could last forever. And yet, it didn't. Ancient Egypt, a name that resonates with mystery, grandeur, and immortality. The civilization that gave us the pyramids, the Sphinx, and the Book of the Dead. The land of kings who called themselves gods, of queens whose beauty shook empires, of monuments so vast they were meant to defy oblivion. For over 3,000 years, Egypt thrived, longer than Rome, longer than Greece, longer than any empire in the history of humankind. And yet, it fell. But tonight, let us step into a different Nile, a different current of time. Let us dare to ask a question that lingers in the hearts of dreamers and historians alike. What if ancient Egypt never declined? What if the kingdom of the Pharaohs never fractured? What if the floods of the Nile were mastered, the invasions repelled, the divisions healed? What if Egypt, the eternal land of the gods, had truly lived up to its name and endured, not as a relic of history, but as a living power shaping the destiny of the world? This is not just a question of what if. It is a journey through time, a reimagining of what might have been. To answer it, we must first descend into the sands of truth to uncover why this mighty civilization, with all its grandeur, with all its achievements, ultimately broke apart. Only then can we imagine what might have been, had its people found a way to rise above the forces that dragged them down. Because history is not only about what was, it is also about what could have been. So, sit back, close your eyes if you wish, and let the desert wind carry you to another Egypt. A land of lotus and papyrus, of towering statues and hidden tombs. A land where time itself was worshipped and kings sought immortality. But before we sail into that alternate Nile, let me invite you to join us on this journey beyond history into the realm of possibility. This is What If Wars, where history takes a different path. Subscribe now and never miss the stories that could have reshaped our world. Now, let us begin. The Nile flows, the pyramids rise, the gods watch, and history waits to be rewritten. The Nile. To the Egyptians, it was not merely a river. It was the beating heart of creation, the divine artery that turned barren desert into the cradle of civilization. Each year, the river rose and fell, bringing with it rich black silt, fertile soil, and the promise of life itself. But like all gifts of nature, it was never constant, and when its rhythm faltered, Egypt trembled. More than once the great kingdom faced famine when the Nile failed to flood as expected. Crops withered, granaries emptied, and the people turned against those who claimed divine right to rule. Around 2200 BCE, during the end of the Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramid builders, a series of low floods devastated the land. Hunger gnawed at the people, and the authority of the pharaoh, once unquestionable, began to erode. Civil war erupted. Local governors, once loyal, declared themselves rulers of their own provinces. Temples lost their wealth. The first intermediate period was born, a time of chaos, of division, when Egypt splintered into fragments of its former self. The lesson was written clearly into the sands. Even a god-king is powerless when the river of life dries up. But environmental challenges were only the beginning. For Egypt, the greatest enemy often came not from the desert beyond, but from within. Succession crises haunted the throne. Pharaohs died young, leaving heirs too weak to rule. Priests grew powerful, rivaling kings in influence. Court officials schemed in shadows, while armies swore allegiance not to Egypt, but to ambitious generals. Again and again, Egypt was torn by the struggle between unity and division, a struggle that left it vulnerable to enemies waiting just beyond the borders. And enemies there were, relentless, patient, and eager to seize the riches of the Nile. The Hyksos came first around 1650 BCE. Invaders from the east, they swept into the delta with weapons Egypt had never seen: horse-drawn chariots, composite bows, bronze blades sharper than any stone tool. They ruled for a century, humbling the land that once thought itself unconquerable. Egypt eventually expelled them, but the scar remained, proof that its isolation behind deserts and seas was no longer enough to guarantee safety. Then came the Assyrians in the 7th century BCE, brutal masters of siege and iron. They struck deep, toppling cities and crushing resistance. The Persians followed in 525 BCE, led by Cambyses II, sweeping Egypt into their vast empire. For nearly 2 centuries, Egypt was little more than a province under Persian satraps. Then Alexander the Great came in 332 BCE, greeted as a liberator, but behind him marched the Macedonian phalanx, and after him the Greeks carved their own dynasty from Egyptian soil. Finally, in 30 BCE, Rome claimed Egypt as its prize. The last queen, Cleopatra Xanthon, fell not to swords but to the tides of politics, her death marking the end of an unbroken line of pharaohs that had stretched for millennia. Why did Egypt fall again and again? Because its walls were high, but its foundation cracked. The economy, once the envy of the world, grew strained. The Nile gave generously, but Egypt became over-dependent on its gifts. When harvests faltered, there was little backup. Heavy taxes broke the backs of farmers, while the elite feasted in gilded halls. Corruption spread through the bureaucracy. The wealth that built pyramids and temples turned to dust when the people could no longer trust that their toil served a greater good. And there was another weakness, one more subtle but just as deadly: the refusal to change. Egypt was a land of tradition, of gods and rituals repeated for centuries. This gave it stability, but also made it slow to adapt. While neighbors advanced with new weapons, new strategies, and new ideas, Egypt often clung to the old ways, trusting that what had once worked would always work. The Hyksos proved otherwise. The Assyrians proved otherwise. The Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, all proved otherwise. Imagine the scene: priests in the temple of Amun chanting the same hymns sung for centuries, while outside the city walls, foreign armies marched with iron spears and siege engines that Egypt had never seen before. Tradition became both shield and shackle. Yet perhaps the greatest tragedy was this: Egypt was too often divided against itself. Pharaoh against priest, noble against noble, brother against brother. Even Cleopatra, last of the Ptolemies, faced betrayal from within her own court before the Romans ever set foot in Alexandria. The empire that once unified the Nile from delta to cataract was undone not only by famine or invasion, but by the cracks in its own soul. By the time Rome claimed Egypt, the pyramids were already ancient. To the Romans, they were monuments of a forgotten age, standing silent as the world moved on. Egypt, once the beacon of civilization, had become a jewel for others to wear, not a crown of its own making. So here, in the ashes of truth, lies the heart of our question. If famine, division, invasion, corruption, and stubborn tradition were the chains that bound Egypt's destiny to decline, then what if those chains had been broken? What if the floods of the Nile were mastered with wisdom? If pharaohs ruled with unity and foresight? If Egypt had embraced innovation instead of resisting it? What if the land of the pharaohs had endured? History tells us why Egypt fell, but imagination allows us to ask, what if it had not? Picture this moment: the late Old Kingdom, around 2200 BCE. The pyramids stand tall, but the Nile falters. Famine spreads, the people despair, and civil war looms. In our world, this was the first intermediate period, a collapse of unity. But in another timeline, imagine if Pharaoh and his advisors had seen the danger and acted differently. Instead of relying solely on the Nile's natural floods, they invest in vast irrigation canals, reservoirs, and grain storage, ensuring that when the river ran low, the people did not starve. The crisis that shattered royal authority never comes. Egypt remains whole, its people fed, its pharaoh respected. Move forward in time, the second intermediate period, when the Hyksos arrived with chariots and bronze weapons. In our history, Egypt was caught unprepared. But in this alternate story, Egypt has already modernized its military, borrowing innovations from neighbors before they could become enemies. Chariots are not a foreign terror, but an Egyptian tool mastered early. Bronze weapons are forged in Egyptian workshops, their armies drilled and disciplined. The Hyksos invasion is met not with shock, but with resistance. Egypt repels them swiftly, its borders secure. Then comes the new kingdom. In our world, the power of Egypt peaked and then decayed under the weight of invasions and corruption. Pharaohs like Ramesses II built monuments to their glory, but drained the treasury, while later rulers struggled to hold their ground. Now imagine instead that the pharaohs of this age balance glory with governance. Temples still rise, but so do schools of scribes, agricultural reforms, and tax systems that do not crush the farmer. Priests hold power, but Pharaoh keeps them in check, ensuring that the kingdom is ruled by one voice, not by factions pulling in different directions. And what of the constant challenge of foreign conquest? Assyrians, Persians, Macedonians, Romans all came because Egypt was rich, fertile, and divided. But imagine a nation more prepared. When Assyria marches west with iron and siege, they find Egypt already armed with iron spears, fortified cities, and a professional army ready to fight. When Persia turns its gaze southward, Egypt is not a weakened kingdom, but a united state, with alliances among Nubians and Levantine cities strong enough to negotiate peace instead of surrender. When Alexander rides into the Delta, he does not find a crumbling land yearning for liberation, but a kingdom still proud, still whole. Perhaps he passes Egypt by, choosing easier conquest elsewhere. This is not the fantasy of Egypt ruling the world. This is the vision of Egypt enduring, weathering storms that once destroyed it, surviving, not expanding, protecting, not conquering. Imagine also the inner reforms. Pharaohs who recognize that the divinity of kingship is strengthened not by distance from their people, but by service to them. Instead of heavy taxes feeding only monuments, wealth is invested in irrigation, granaries, and roads. Instead of temples hoarding power, priests are woven into a broader system of governance, balanced and checked by royal authority. Instead of waiting for the Nile to bless them, Egyptians mastered the river itself with dams and channels, ensuring that famine never again becomes the spark of collapse. Tradition remains. The hymns, the rituals, the worship of Ra and Osiris. But alongside tradition grows adaptation. Innovations are not rejected, but absorbed. Foreign merchants bring new ideas. And Egypt listens. Weapons from abroad are studied and improved. Methods of governance from neighbors are adopted and reshaped in Egyptian style. The kingdom remains Egyptian at its core, but not closed off to the winds of change. It is in these choices, in this vision, that Egypt could have rewritten its destiny, not by conquering the world, not by replacing Rome or Greece or Persia, but by standing firm, by ensuring that when the tides of history rose against it, the land of the Nile stood unbroken. A stable, resilient Egypt, lasting not for 3,000 years, but perhaps forever. The Nile rolls endlessly, and in this story it carries with it not decline but endurance. The kingdom of the pharaohs does not fracture, it bends but never breaks. The old kingdom remains unshaken by famine, for its rulers prepare. Granaries stand full, canals stretch across the floodplains, and when the river falters, the people still eat. Pharaoh remains more than a king. He remains the center of the universe, and the trust between ruler and ruled does not shatter. The first intermediate period never comes. Egypt holds together, strong, unbroken. Time moves forward, and the Middle Kingdom rises not from chaos, but from stability. Pharaohs rule with strength, their officials loyal, their courts orderly. The Hyksos ride from the east with chariots, as they always did. But this time, Egypt is ready. Egyptian chariots meet them in the delta. Egyptian bows send arrows through the air. Bronze blades clash against bronze, and the invaders are driven back. The Nile Valley does not bow to foreign kings. It remains its own master, its own soul. The new kingdom arrives in brilliance. Temples rise toward the sun. Queens wear crowns of power. Pharaohs carve their names in stone. But unlike before, this golden age does not wither under corruption and weakness. Pharaohs balance glory with care. Temples grow but do not overshadow the throne. Priests chant their prayers but remain loyal. The people thrive. Farmers plow their fields without fear of famine. Merchants sail to distant ports. When the sea peoples sweep across the Mediterranean, they find not a fragile kingdom, but a wall of iron and discipline. Egyptian armies stand firm, their alliances strong, their borders secure. The invaders break like waves against the stone of the Nile. Egypt remains. Centuries pass and new powers rise. Assyria builds its empire, its kings ruthless and cruel. But when they march toward Egypt, they find a kingdom still armed, still united. Fortified cities block their advance. Iron weapons meet iron weapons, and the Assyrian dream of ruling the Nile dissolves in the desert heat. Later, Persia turns its eyes toward the delta. Cambyses rides with ambition, but he finds Egypt not weary and divided, but whole, ready, unwilling to bend. Treaties are signed, trade flows, but the throne of Pharaoh still shines with its own light. Alexander comes young and unstoppable, the conqueror of nations. In our world, he was welcomed into Egypt, but here the welcome never comes. Egypt is strong, its pharaoh commands loyalty, its army commands respect. Alexander measures the cost and passes by, chasing Persia's crown instead. Alexandria is never born by his hand, though cities of trade still grow upon the coast, raised by Egyptians themselves, filled with merchants who carry the world's goods to and from the Nile. The temples of Amun and Ra do not fade into memory. They remain alive, filled with smoke and song, pillars of a faith that stretches across seas. Isis crosses the Mediterranean not as a foreign goddess, but as the living heart of a great kingdom. The centuries turn and Rome rises. Its legions march, its empire swells, but Egypt is not a jewel waiting to be seized. The grain of the Nile is traded, not stolen. The legions never plant their standards in Memphis, never claim the delta as their own. Rome respects Egypt, competes with it, bargains with it, but cannot claim to own it. Cleopatra is not the last. The line of pharaohs does not end in a lover's tomb, but continues, sovereign and proud. And what of daily life in this living Egypt? Walk the streets of Thebes, and they do not echo with silence. They are alive with chants, with the rhythm of markets, with the footsteps of generations who know their kingdom still stands. Farmers guide water through canals that never run dry. Children scratch hieroglyphs onto clay tablets, learning not the memory of a dead tongue, but the voice of their living people. Artisans carve stone into shapes that honor not ghosts, but rulers who still walk among them. Trade caravans pour in from Nubia with gold, from the Levant with cedar, from distant lands with spices. Egyptian ships sail across the Mediterranean, their sails swollen with wind, their decks heavy with grain, linen, papyrus. The people live not in the shadow of ruins, but in the light of continuity. Their gods are not silent. Their pharaohs are not gone. Their kingdom, eternal in name, proves eternal in truth. And so Egypt moves through time, not as a relic, not as a chapter ended, but as a living nation beside Greece, beside Rome, beside Byzantium. The sands of the desert still shift, the Nile still flows, but the crown of the pharaoh endures. Civilization after civilization may rise and fall, but Egypt remains, its temples lit, its people proud, its heart unbroken. The centuries turn, and Egypt does not fall. The pyramids do not become ancient relics watched over by conquerors, but symbols of a living civilization still commanding the desert. The Nile continues to pulse with life, not as the silent witness of a lost kingdom, but as the eternal spine of a nation that has endured. And so we must ask, if this had been the world we inherited, what would have changed? Look first to architecture. In our history, the age of the pyramid gave way to silence, but imagine if it had not. Imagine if Egyptian stonecraft continued unbroken for thousands of years more, evolving with each generation. Perhaps cities of colossal obelisks would rise, monuments blending the ancient with the modern of their time. Perhaps whole avenues lined with statues would have stretched across the desert, not as ruins, but as living streets of worship and pride. While Rome built its colosseums, Egypt might have still raised temples on a scale that dwarfed imagination, temples not to memory, but to power still alive. And religion, what of the gods? In our history, the faith of Egypt faded, its pantheon reduced to myths carved in dead stone. But in this world, the worship of Ra, of Isis, of Osiris, continues into the heart of the Mediterranean. The goddess Isis, whose cult did spread to Rome in fragments of reality, might have become one of the dominant deities of the ancient world, not as a foreign curiosity, but as the living faith of a kingdom that never died. Across the sea, Greek philosophers would still write, but beside them Egyptian priests might debate the mysteries of the afterlife, of creation, of the eternal soul. The spiritual language of the Mediterranean would not belong to one culture alone, but would echo with the hymns of the Nile. And science. Egypt was not only temples and tombs, it was medicine, astronomy, mathematics. In our world, its discoveries were absorbed and forgotten, rediscovered by others centuries later. But imagine if Egypt had kept its momentum, building schools, supporting scribes, training physicians generation after generation. The study of the stars, recorded by priests atop temple roofs, might have advanced sooner. Calendars, medicine, engineering, all could have leapt forward, shaping the knowledge of the wider world. A stable Egypt, trading with Greece, with Persia, with later Rome, might have become the bridge that carried science farther, faster. Consider, too, the balance of power. In our history, the rise of Greece and Rome filled the vacuum left by Egypt's decline. Their philosophies, their armies, their empires set the course of the Western world. But what if Egypt had still stood strong? Perhaps Greece would not have so easily dominated the Eastern Mediterranean. Perhaps Rome would have found itself not master of all, but checked by a neighbor as old as time itself. The world might still have known Rome, still have known Greece, but it would also have known Egypt as an equal voice, an enduring pillar beside them, shaping the destiny of nations and the people. The countless lives along the river. How different their days would have been if famine had never broken them, if conquest had never crushed them, if pharaohs had ruled not only with glory, but with foresight. Imagine generations who grew up not in the ruins of a fading dream, but in the streets of a kingdom still alive, still building, still believing that the gods walked among them. Farmers plowing fields rich with grain, even in years of weak floods. Children learning to write the sacred signs of their ancestors, artisans carving wonders that would not lie in ruin, but shine in their own age. All of it possible had Egypt endured. And yet, history is what it is. The pyramids we see today are silent. The gods are carved into stone that no longer hears prayers. The Nile flows, but it carries no pharaoh's barge. Egypt became not the eternal kingdom, but a chapter in the book of human history. Its grandeur admired as past, its power remembered as gone. Still, when we ask these questions, when we imagine what might have been, we are not only dreaming of an Egypt that survived, we are reflecting on ourselves, on the choices that make civilizations endure or collapse, on the thin line between glory and ruin, on how foresight, unity, and adaptation can turn the tide of destiny. Because in truth, the lesson of Egypt is not that nothing lasts. It is that greatness requires more than monuments and armies. It requires wisdom, balance, resilience. It requires the courage to change while remaining true to what you are. If Egypt had done so, the world today might still bear its crown. Perhaps we would measure time not in Roman calendars, but in Egyptian cycles. Perhaps we would speak not of Greco-Roman culture, but of Nile Mediterranean culture, where Isis, Ra, and Osiris still walked beside Zeus and Jupiter. Perhaps our very cities would carry more of Egypt's lines, more of its soul. But history chose another path. The pyramids stand silent. The pharaohs are gone. And we, centuries later, are left to wonder. So as you hear these words, as you imagine temples still standing in their glory, as you see the Nile not as a relic, but as a power still flowing through a living empire, ask yourself, what if? What if the land of the gods had never fallen? What if its people had found the wisdom to endure? What kind of world would you be living in now? Perhaps the answer is unknowable. Perhaps it is only a dream. But in that dream, the sands of Egypt are not ruins, but foundations. The pyramids are not tombs, but towers of power. The Nile does not carry silence, but the songs of a people who never surrendered. And so, we are left with the question that lingers like the desert wind across the timeless stones. If Egypt had endured, perhaps the world we know today would still carry the heartbeat of the Nile. But history chose another path. And so we wonder, what might have been?